going on, guys? Welcome to episode 44 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, Josh and I are going to touch on the overall concept for performance in hypertrophy. We're going to go through some of the takeaways from our recent newsletter regarding frequency for muscle growth, but get it kicked off here with a warm-up question that kind of ties those things together and lead us to that topic. Without further ado, if you don't mind, go ahead, leave a 5-star rating review for the podcast, but I'm going to kick it over to Josh here for the warm-up question.
Yeah, hopefully we can stay true to this initial question from Kyriakos, is I believe how you say it. I'll just kind of paraphrase it here in a second. It's definitely can be a can of worms, but I wanted to answer this question because I think it fits in nicely to probably some of the general discussion we'll have on Zach's most recent newsletter, covering a new study on frequency for muscle growth and some more edge case considerations for frequency than I think most people think about. So anyway, this question, just to very simply paraphrase it, is basically asking about the effective reps model. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, basically the idea that the last few reps as you approach failure are the ones that really count for hypertrophy. It's been proposed that there's a hard cutoff at like 5 reps in reserve. Others take a more fluid approach, if you will, to this model. But, just to make sure we're on the same page, that's the general concept for the effective reps model for hypertrophy. But this question was asking about that model and how rest pause training fits into that. So again, to make sure everyone's on the same page, rest pause training would be basically doing kind of a traditional set to start and then taking short rest periods and then kind of doing mini sets after that. And basically in this case, you could say, okay, I could do my normal set to failure or to 1 RIR or whatever the case may be, rest a little bit, get a few more reps, and accumulate more effective reps super easily by kind of using the fatigue from that first set or the previous kind of mini sets that you did before. So from a high level, the question I want to dig into briefly here is how fatigue, so previous set fatigue, can influence this quote unquote effectiveness of a given repetition. Before I get into that and a few representative studies, I'll just kind of go on record and say that just to make our general position clear, or our general interpretation of the research, I should say at this point in time, that we probably shouldn't view the effective reps model from a strict sense that, we should be specifically counting how many quote unquote effective reps we get. In my experience from the stint of time I did kind of try to take that approach, it can lead to some pretty weird practical applications. But I think the general high-level concept makes a lot of sense. Where the exact cutoff is in terms of when a rep starts to become effective, to what degree do they become more effective or less effective as you get closer to failure, is still very much to be determined. But I just wanted to be clear. I'm going to kind of use it as I'm going to use this model to allow us to go through kind of a thought experiment and to conceptualize this idea, as opposed to saying, I very much believe, full stop, the effective reps model is the way to go for hypertrophy. Okay, so there's 2 kind of positions I think you can justifiably take on this question based on the research we have right now. Again, the question we're looking at is how fatigue influences the effectiveness of a given repetition. So basically, let's say you have a single repetition in which you complete it. After you complete it, you have 2 reps in the tank. But going into that set, you were very well recovered. Your performance is high. You had 5 minutes of rest. Compare that to another repetition at where you have 2 reps after you complete it left in the tank. But you went into that set fatigued, so performance was down. So the question I'm kind of curious about, or I want to talk about a little bit here, is how does that preset fatigue or lack thereof influence the effectiveness of those quote unquote effective reps as you approach the end of a set? And again, there's kind of 2 positions that I think you could justifiably take, and I'll talk about kind of where my head's at right now. And again, I think this is relevant to what we're going to talk about with the frequency study that Zach's going to review here in a second. So the first position, and this is one that I used to really buy into, probably as recently as a couple months ago, in that all that truly matters is the proximity to failure, so long as you're doing about 5 reps per set. So in other words, I just wasn't bought into the fact that the performance of a set for hypertrophy matters. So to be very clear, we're talking about hypertrophy here, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're able to truly get to the desired proximity to failure, and you're able to truly keep that consistent. Then I think you're going to see similar hypertrophy.
The
Zach, you want
one
to jump
th- the
in?
one thing I just want to say on the front end here, because I think this is really easy to misinterpret. When he says the mindset was that performance doesn't matter, that means acutely. So if you're doing something acutely to potentially decrease, for example, how many reps you could perform at a given load, that would be decreasing performance, but that is within that session. You could still expect performance to improve over time. So I think that's just a slight distinction I always like to make when we kind of talk about this topic that I think can get misinterpreted to say that like, oh, performance never matters. Therefore, if I'm getting worse over the, a 6 month period, that's fine. But that's not the argument. It's mostly just saying acutely in this one session, we could potentially do some strategies that acutely harm performance, but could be fine over the long term. There you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's very important. And I think that's going to be illustrated well in the one kind of direct study we have on rest pause models. And you'll see how the protocol for the rest pause group is basically set up to harm acute performance, but it might not harm their ability to progress, right? And make progress over time. So this is a study from Prestes and colleagues, and we'll link it in the description. It's from 2017. Again, I think there might be one other direct study on rest pause, but this is kind of the one that I think got the ball rolling in the community on rest pause. So in the traditional group, they performed 3 sets of 6 reps at 80% of 1RM with 2 minutes rest. So theoretically, probably no problems performing maximally or close to maximally for each set. And then the rest pause group, they did 1 set to failure with 80%. And then they did mini sets or cluster sets, whatever you want to call them, every 20 seconds after that until they got 18 reps total. Okay. So basically, the load, so the percentage of 1RM and the total reps were equated, but the way they got there was a little bit different. And you can see for the traditional group, for each of those sets, they went in pretty fresh, whereas for the rest pause, they went into most sets quite fatigued. And overall, there were no between group differences in the study and changes in muscle size, but the results actually leaned a little bit in favor of the rest pause group. I would use this as an interesting concept as opposed to, the nail in the coffin that rest pause is the way to go. There's some considerable limitations with this study. Most importantly is that there's no clear indication in the manuscript of how that traditional group progressed to load, if at all. The subjects also weren't very well trained. I think the initial bench press 1RMs at pre-testing were like 75 kilos. They also trained leg press, but I just remember kind of the bench press 1RMs off the top of my head. And again, this is something that's interesting, but it's one study. Some limitations, as always, with any individual study. But that is kind of some evidence to say that all that matters is the proximity to failure, so long as you're, doing at least a few reps per set, and kind of matching total work. So that's one position you could take. There's another study, I believe, by Ennis and colleagues that kind of follows a similar takeaway as well. But I'll try to keep this truly as a warm up question. So the second position, and kind of where I've been leaning more so lately, is that shorter rest periods. So something like a rest pause protocol, or something like just short rest periods, right? Like only resting a minute between sets. They are worse, but we can do more sets and make up for it. And again, there's kind of research on the other side of the aisle that supports this. So there's a study by Ozaki and colleagues, which is a pretty well-cited study on drop sets. I'll kind of just highlight 2 groups here. One group trained bicep curls with 3 sets to failure with 80% of their 1RM. And then the drop set group basically started with 80% of their 1RM, went to failure, then dropped it to 65% of their 1RM, went to failure, then 50% to failure, then 40% to failure, then 30% to failure. So that's effectively like 5 quote unquote sets compared to 3 quote unquote sets in the traditional group. And there were no differences between these 2 groups in hypertrophy. So again, this might kind of indicate that, you can see similar hypertrophy. You just have to do more quote unquote sets and to kind of accumulate more quote unquote effective reps. Because if you were to only count effective reps in that study, I think the drop set group would be considerably higher on that front. In a similar kind of concept, there's a study by Ahtiainen, I believe is how you pronounce it. I believe this was a leg extension study. Basically, this was a really, really nice study design. And if I recall correctly, it was also within subjects. And they had, again, just to highlight, I think it was 2 of the 4 groups. A group that was training with 3 minutes rest, so kind of like a traditional group, compared to a group training with 1 minute rest, but they did more sets to get the same total workload as the group training with longer rest periods. They were able to equalize hypertrophy that way. Whereas another third group that didn't equalize total workload and instead just did the same number of sets but with less rest, they saw worse hypertrophy. So again, from these 2 studies, you might say, hey, shorter rest periods are worse, and every single time you touch a 2 RIR in training, it matters how you got there. That's where I'm leaning more. I think the evidence is a little bit stronger. I think the Presti study and the NE study are interesting, but again, I'm kind of leaning towards that second explanation or that second position, and that performance does matter. And going into a set fresher and reaching the same RER is going to lead to better muscle growth. But that's very much a position that could change over time. And another reason that I'm kind of led to that position is this new study that Zach's going to go over here in a little bit. But Zach, before you get into that frequency study, do you have anything you think you need to clean up or clarify or add on about this rest pause concept?
No, I don't think. I think you did a great job. Obviously, the few things I kind of have contrasting like limitations to bring up for each things that you said that I think are important to keep in mind. So for the first half, for the rest pause studies, I do think the more that we've kind of thought about this, and like you said, I think I used to lean in direction of number 1. Now I'm probably leaning in direction of number 2. Is that I think those are a unique case in the sense that by equating the total number of repetitions, you're basically equating the volume load as well.
Yeah.
The progression is a problem in that first Presti study that makes it a little bit more challenging there. But I believe in the NS one, that was the kind of the intention to make sure that volume load was matched, and you're kind of manipulating the protocol to make sure that that's the case, and that's in effect basically accounting for performance declines of the other protocol. So in a way, those are still supporting the fact that shorter rest periods are worse and you kind of have to do additional sets, albeit less total reps per set than what we would traditionally count, to kind of make sure that that is accounting for that decreased performance on a set-to-set basis. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then the other thing was with that Ozaki study with the drop sets, just realizing that while that is decent evidence to suggest that the drop sets are potentially less efficient due to those shorter rest periods, it also could just be the case that there's diminishing returns for the additional sets as well. You'd need an additional group that just performed the 3 sets with the drop set structure to like truly see if they are less efficient. But nonetheless, like you said, it's evidence, and especially the Ahtiainen study, I think that kind of pushes me more in the direction of the performance, in addition to what we'll talk about here in a little bit. But overall, totally agree with what you said. Just a few other considerations to keep in mind.
Perfect. So I think in short, kind of our general position is that performance probably does matter, but that's not to say that you can't do rest pause, you can't do shorter rest period protocols, drop sets, that kind of thing. You might just have to do a little bit more to make up for it. That would be my guess right now. Go for it, Zach.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is that the the performance declines, like what is a meaningful performance decline, is something we don't have a solid answer to. But also, I think that is extremely individual. This is
And
something
exercise dependent.
yeah, exercise dependent as well. But this is something just us having experience in research has been something I've just been astounded to the degree of which set to set fatigue is
It's
individual.
crazy, man.
It
It's
is
crazy.
absolutely ridiculous, and that is when
Like
we have gone out.
some
Yeah, go
people
ahead.
just absolutely fall off a cliff. Some people just absolutely fall off a cliff. Some people will just do a gut wrenching set and be able to do it again in whatever 3 minutes. the individual differences are just absolutely incredible. Like I'm just doubling down on it. Um, yeah, I'll let you continue, but I just
Yeah,
like
no, no,
I really want to emphasize that.
100%. And I think the reason I bring that up is I think that sets up the conversation around this study really, really well and the ultimate takeaway. But yeah, it's one of those things where you talk about like, yeah, there's individual differences, you know, people are different. And in your head, you may be thinking like, oh, okay, maybe somebody goes 10, 8, 6 with their reps and another person maybe goes, I don't know, 10, 5, 4. But like I've seen like 10, 2, got to drop the load another 5-10% to even get another rep. Like it's really significant differences in terms of set to set fatigue, which like I said, I think will be relevant here in a little bit.
Right. So there's different ways you can kind of manipulate that approach within session, but also if you think about the overall quality of work over the course of a week, you can manipulate training frequency. And that kind of sets things up for this study from Zach. Zach, I'll kick it over to you in 1 second, but I'll say that like there's maybe a few studies that come out every year that truly shift kind of like my perspective on something or make me think of something in a slightly different way. Not because a single study is the holy grail ever, really, but instead it just kind of by going through the study, by thinking about it, by talking about it, you just kind of shift the way you think about things, even if it's just like a novel design that you didn't really think about, which I think is pretty relevant here. And this is one of those studies, and this just kind of is one of those studies that shifted my mental model about training a little bit, even though I would still characterize it as kind of a preliminary evidence, as most studies are that are kind of looking at a new concept. But with that, Zach, I'll kick it over to you, let you go over this, and yeah, then we'll chat about it.
Cool. Yeah, so I completely agree. Like this study we're going to talk about was I kind of titled the newsletter "The Best Look at Training Frequency for Muscle Growth Yet," and I truly believe that. I think the study was extremely well designed. Had some things in there that I don't think on the front end you would really think about being necessary, but I think were really really helpful. But yeah, just to get us started here, let's kind of touch on the rationale for training frequency for muscle growth in the first place. So, going from like a historical perspective, the kind of the narrative surrounding training frequency has kind of shifted over time, right? Like you probably have heard, people talking about bro splits, in which generally, you have a day where you hit chest, day you hit legs, day you hit arms, that kind of thing. And depending on how that's set up, there could be some hidden different frequencies there, but the overall paradigm there is, generally speaking, lower frequencies training. Then, as kind of the evidence-based scene kind of started to emerge, we start getting this evidence showing that, to some degree, training volumes related to hypertrophy, people start performing greater weekly set volumes. It kind of necessitates an increase in training frequency, even just from a logistical perspective. So that's where you kind of start getting into the 2 or 3 times a week kind of per muscle group training, and even sometimes greater than that with kind of the new wave of training like more in like a full body style where things are getting hit maybe even up to 4 or 5 times a week. And so there's kind of been like this, the entire spectrum kind of has been painted, and there's been successful anecdotes from experienced lifters kind of around the entire thing with frequency. And so you kind of ask yourself like, okay, what are some of the theoretical benefits for training frequency? And I think there's kind of two main ones that you'll hear people talk about the most. I think the one kind of mechanistic argument that people are going to generally bring up is the fact that in trained individuals, particularly elevations in muscle protein synthesis, particularly the myofibrillar portion of that, seem to be shorter lived in trained individuals than in untrained individuals. So if that's kind of the best candidate proxy, although there are definitely limitations to muscle protein synthesis, but it's kind of the best candidate proxy we have for like acute muscle growth. If that kind of spike declines, the idea being if we hit it with another training session relatively frequently, we can have more area under the curve with MPS. And over time, the idea would be that would lead to greater muscle growth. So for trained individuals with those shorter lived, bursts of MPS, more frequent training sessions will allow us to accumulate more area under the curve. And then the other one would be that, like we just talked about, higher frequencies. If I'm performing a number of sets, let's say 10 throughout a given training week, splitting that up into more sessions per week is just going to allow me to have better performance in total for all of those sets. So if I'm performing 10 sets of squats per week, let's say, doing 10 sets of squats relatively close to failure with one-on-one training session, I'm probably going to have to reduce the load considerably by the time I get to that 10th set. Whereas if I break it up over 2, 3, 4 sessions per week, I'm probably going to be able to perform, a greater amount of sets with a higher absolute load and leading to more overall volume load throughout the week on that exercise. So those are the two predominant theoretical benefits for frequency. But of course, as we often bring up, proxy arguments like that, particularly the mechanistic ones, it's really important to investigate something like the longitudinal evidence to see if those arguments hold up, as there's a ton of other things that could kind of come into play here to see if that actually plays out into the outcomes that we would expect. And so we do have like a really solid meta-analysis on frequency by Gurgic and colleagues, where they essentially, to state the findings simply, although it was relatively complex, training frequency independent of training volume doesn't really seem to matter, in the sense that if we have a given weekly set volume, breaking that up into different frequencies per week really doesn't seem to have a large effect, particularly when you use direct measurements of muscle size. So like the higher quality measurements, MRI, B-mode ultrasound, things like that. So that is really the best evidence that we have on the topic. However, to set up the study we're going to talk about, most of the studies, including the Gurgic meta-analysis, again, particularly the ones that use direct measurements of muscle size that are a bit higher quality, are between subject designs. And for hypertrophy, as we've discussed on the podcast before, those have some limitations, right? You're comparing one group of individuals that has a certain diet, a certain lifestyle that leads to a certain amount of stress, nutrition habits, all those kind of things that you can't really control when you have a between subjects design, and also genetics. But using a within subjects design where one limb does one protocol, the other limb does the other protocol, you're in theory able to control for a lot of those things, making them really useful for hypertrophy in particular. And so that brings us to this new study by Neves et al., where they did look at the effect of training frequency in a within participant design. It also had a between subjects component, but we'll touch on that here in a little bit. And just like a general run through, again, you can look at the newsletter for more details on this, where I kind of break through every single detail about it. Trained individuals, 11-week training period, and they were split into two overall groups. And so this is the between subjects component. One of them I'm going to call the restricted progression group, because I think that more accurately describes and it's easier to understand the difference here. So the restricted progression group, which was 12 individuals, and then they had a flexible progression group, which was a separate 12 individuals. Basically, the difference between these groups is that in the restricted progression group, the limb that was assigned to the low frequency condition, which was training once a week, they basically did their 9 sets throughout the week on a leg press. They did what they did. They performed however they were going to. And then the other limb that was assigned to the higher frequency condition, or 3 times a week, they had to match the volume load used in that limb. So they were basically restricted in their ability to perform because they had to match the 1 time a week condition that, like we talked about, is basically going to have artificially lower performance, as they have to perform all 9 of those sets in the exact same session. So the exact details of how they did that, again, in the newsletter, I'm going to kind of breeze over that here, but they basically equated the volume load by restricting the progression of the higher frequency group. Now, in the other kind of overall group, again, the separate 12 individuals, they had flexible progression, where they basically allowed each limb to progress load independently of one another, and allowed for the inherent benefits or the logistical benefits of training frequency to be taken advantage of. They basically made it so that the 3 times a week group could in fact train with greater volume loads. And it was about 16% greater with the higher frequency condition. So obviously took muscle size pre and post the training period, and they did that with MRI. So it was a really high quality measurement. And so then they kind of took a look at things here. And so the kind of the main things that I think are interesting here is, A, does the group that did not equate training volume have any differences between groups? It's the most ecologically valid kind of look at training frequency, as those kind of benefits of allowing you to perform better are something you're going to take advantage of in practice. But also, do the results differ between groups? Because what that'll do is it kind of isolates the logistical benefits of training frequency, in the sense that the one group, is training with greater frequency, but they're also just logistically going to get additional training volume. Whereas the other group that was restricted in their progression, we can somewhat isolate the inherent effects of anything related to, the muscle biology going on of additional training frequency. And so what we saw was in that kind of the first comparison, comparing the 1 versus 3 times a week frequencies in the flexible progression group, where the 3 times a week group could kind of perform ad libitum almost. They saw trivial between group differences, but the hypertrophy did somewhat lean in favor of the 3 times a week group. And then in the other group, the restricted progression group, there was basically no differences between groups. So what that kind of signals to us is that for the most part, the additional benefits to training frequency probably are driven by benefits to performance. Because when we take those out of the equation by restricting the progression in the higher frequency group, there doesn't really seem to be a benefit for training frequency. Now, a few limitations on the front end here. Based on the way that they did control training volume, it's kind of impossible to equate load and RAR. They probably had to make some concessions there in the higher frequency group to make sure that training volume was equated. But nonetheless, I still think this is a really solid overall picture to kind of test that hypothesis. And so ultimately, the takeaway here, I think, is on the group level, doesn't really seem to be a huge effect of training frequency for muscle growth, which would go to support what the Gurgic meta-analysis says. But I think the most interesting part is when we kind of dig into some of these individual findings on the participant level, and I think that's where the kind of the most interesting takeaways come, over the surface here. But I'm going to stop there and see if Josh has anything to chime in here.
Yeah, man. I think that was a really, really good overview. Ultimately, I think that from here on out, the group we will talk about is that flexible progression group, right? Where one leg trained 9 sets per session, 1 time per week. The other leg rather did 3 sets per session, 3 times a week, right? I think that's where things get really interesting. Before we dive deeper into that, should we just put like a disclaimer out there in terms of how they did the stats and just probably add a layer of caution?
Sure, yeah. So when I talk about trivial differences between groups, one of the things reported in the paper was a moderate effect size in favor of the higher frequency condition. That's not incorrect by any means, but just the way that it was calculated is kind of something slightly different than what we typically are looking at with these kind of things. So that's more of like a signal to noise type effect size that they reported. Whereas generally speaking, we're more interested in kind of the magnitude of the effects and comparing those between groups. I talk about this in the newsletter, but ultimately, I would think that it's probably a little bit more accurate to kind of look at the magnitude of the changes in terms of what we're actually interested in here for our purposes. So that's what I kind of focused on here. And so I recalculated some of the effect size based on some of the data reported. And when you do it that way, there were trivial differences between groups.
And if you just do traditional hypothesis testing between conditions, between the lower frequency and the higher frequency in that flexible progression group, there was no group by time interaction, meaning there was no statistical differences between those higher and lower frequencies for the flexible progression. Is that correct?
Yeah, they were at least picked up by the model. Of course, there's
Right.
limitations to that as well, just relying on the p-values. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, yes, group by time, there was no significant interaction there.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that clear that, again, I kind of mentioned before that this is preliminary. And Zach, I don't want to steal your thunder, so feel free to stop me here. But I think where things get really interesting, in my opinion, are the between individual differences in differences between hypertrophy or between frequencies. So I think getting a visual representation of this is very, very helpful. So I'd encourage everyone to go to the link in the description or the show notes or whatever of this podcast, pull up the article and go to the first figure in the results section. Zach made a really nice visual here, even with data-driven strength colors, which I think is pretty cool. And basically, in that flexible progression group, each line is an individual, and then each point that kind of makes up that line is the individual's leg. And just this is not any formal statistics by any means, but just looking at it, it looks like about half of the folks did very similar between their legs, whereas the other half of the folks did considerably better with 3 times per week frequency. So that might kind of segue nicely into why that might be the case for some individuals, and then I'll pass the baton to you, Zach, and see what you think.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. So that's exactly where I was going to take it next. Like on the group level, this basically is exactly in line with some of the previous research, and like I said, that meta-analysis by Gurgic and colleagues saying that on the group level, training frequency doesn't really seem to have an effect independent of training volume. Now, like you said, when we dig into some of the individual data that was reported, there's some definitely interesting things going on. So the first thing to notice is that the individual variability is greater in the flexible progression group than it is in the restricted progression group. So that alone is interesting to me, just to say that when training volume, we go out of our way to equate that, the individual variability shrinks a little bit between the differences between protocols. Now, going over to the flexible progression group, like Josh said, we're going to focus on here for the most part now. There was a good amount of individuals that definitely benefited from the higher frequency condition, a good amount of people that did relatively the same, and then there was a few that probably benefited a little bit more from the lower frequency condition, although not nearly to the same extent as the higher frequency condition. Yeah, it's nominal, but yeah.
It's hard to say, right? I think it'd be really cool to look at kind of a similar approach that the Dama study did from 2019 to kind of indicate, like, is this, I think they used
Standard deviations.
No, not two standard deviations. I think it was two times
It's
the
two times
measurement
the
error.
error. Yeah, two times measurement error. Sorry.
Two times measurement error. Zach, they probably didn't do that in this study, I'm assuming, right?
I honestly can't remember.
Okay. Yeah. That'd be interesting too. Like, I just want to be clear. We're kind of eyeballing it. Yes, some people definitely, like, their progression in the lower frequency leg was better, but there are some that it's dramatically better in that high frequency leg. Whereas I don't really see any, just visually looking at it, where it's dramatically better in the low frequency leg.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be a nominal slight improvement that very well might just be measurement error.
For sure. And it's one of those things I bring that up because I do think it's at least plausible that if you sample 100 people, there's probably a good amount of people that probably would benefit to the lower frequencies just based on anecdotes. So I like to keep the door open there, but generally speaking, I agree with what you said.
Yeah.
And so the question is, like, okay, so why is this the case? Is there anything we can kind of point to here that kind of explains those individual differences? And I think going back to one of the things I mentioned, the 16% differences in volume load between groups, I think becomes relevant here. So when I was writing the article, I calculated the differences between volume load. And honestly, I was a little bit surprised it wasn't more than that. And so I started thinking about that. I was like, okay, let's just play this out in kind of like a really practical example. If I'm doing 3 sets to failure at a given weight, what does 16% more volume load look like? And I think it was only like 3 or 4 reps over the course, like 3 sets to failure, starting with like a 10 rep max or so. And so I was like, I don't know if that seems justifiable to see a meaningful greater increase. But then I took a look at the flexible progression graph again, and there were some individuals that definitely benefited from 3 times a week and others that really didn't seem to do so. And so then I started thinking about what would have been really, really cool. Just unfortunately, the authors didn't report this analysis, is that looking on the individual level, if there was a correlation between the degree of difference in volume load accumulated by the 2 protocols, so the high frequency and the low frequency, and seeing if that correlates in the difference in muscle size between those 2 protocols. What I suspect is that the individuals that meaningfully benefited from the higher frequency condition probably are the individuals that, like we were mentioning earlier, drop off a cliff in performance after a set close to failure at a given rest period. Those individuals stand to benefit the most in terms of performance by breaking those sets up across multiple sessions. So that is what I think the most interesting potential thing that I would love to see a study kind of try to do this in a similar design, or even a follow-up analysis with this paper and their data, looking at the correlation between those 2 things. Because what that would start to kind of bring to the forefront from a practical perspective is that if you're able to maintain performance across sets, that are generally considered with the other variables productive for hypertrophy, moderate rep range, pretty close to failure, that kind of thing, executed well. If you're able to maintain repetition performance pretty well set to set, you may not stand to benefit a ton from higher frequency training, and then you can almost entirely rely on preference in that case. Whereas if you are the type of person that seems to have meaningful fatigue set to set, and you drop your performance considerably after a set that's really close to failure, you potentially could stand to benefit, even considerably on the individual level from higher frequencies. And so I think this kind of brings us full circle to the original kind of warm up question of how this connects with the rest pause stuff, in the sense that this does support pretty well that performance does seem to matter for hypertrophy, which I think is pretty logical. But it really makes you think about setting your training up in a way that's going to allow you to maximize the output of the sets that you're having. But if you can do some things to potentially, what's the word I'm thinking for? Accumulate's not the right word. What's compact maybe some of that training volume a little bit.
Condense.
Condense, there you go. Condense the training volume you are performing a little bit more, so long as it doesn't harm your performance. That's also seems to be a pretty viable option. I think that's where we can kind of merge these two things that we talked about together, and suggest that, yeah, performance probably does matter, at least to some degree. And on the individual level, training frequency can be manipulated to hopefully improve performance. And as long as it meaningfully does so, that may end up benefiting your longitudinal adaptations. Obviously, limitation here, they didn't actually report this, so we can't actually know that. It's just a strong suspicion that I have just based on looking at the individual data here.
Yeah. This might be confirmation bias because I'm really excited by this idea. Like Zach said multiple times, I just really want to make it clear. They didn't actually run this analysis, so we don't know this for sure. But when kind of thinking back through my own training, or reflecting on my own training and also that of my clients, it seems to make a good amount of sense. And kind of from a practical perspective, something I'm going to start experimenting with is typically when I notice that someone has like insane performance drop off within a session, or I notice that for myself, I just assume, or my general approach in that case is that you're probably you would probably stand to benefit from low weekly volumes. That's kind of been my hunch up to this point, which might be true. But an alternative approach is to see if you can maintain a slightly higher volume that is higher quality and just do more exposures to it. So like for me, for example, my tricep train, when I do any tricep training, the set to set performance drop off is just insane. Like even if I do pretty long rest periods for triceps, let's say 3 minutes, I can sometimes that 3 minute rest period can sometimes cut the reps in half. Even if I leave 1 or 2 reps in the tank, which is just not the case for other muscles. So based on this, I might see better results from keeping set volume the same. I might even have the ability to bump it up, but I could keep it the same. And instead of direct tricep training, say twice a week, maybe I do it 4 times a week or 5 times a week, just a couple sets per session. Maybe there's something going on there. That's something I'm probably going to start experimenting with. And that's kind of my new mental model. But of course is tentative as always. But yeah, I think this was really well done, Zach. I don't think I have a ton to add. Is there any other discussions you want to, or any other practical implications or anything else you want to discuss?
I just want to hit on the one limitation we did discuss a little bit. There's a few things just to touch on, just to keep in mind when we're talking about this. As always, we view this mostly as idea fuel. This is the second within participant design on training frequency. You mentioned the other one by Damas and colleagues. That one did not equate set volumes. It's a little bit more of a hybrid frequency volume study. But ultimately, it's the first study that is going to be investigating this in a really, really high quality way. We stand to learn a lot from more studies in the future, but I do think this one is really interesting and really helpful, like you said, to kind of construct a mental model of how to change training frequency on the individual level, at least tentatively. The other thing is that the overall volumes in this study weren't super high. It was only about 9 sets per week on a leg press with quads. And so, based tentatively on around the idea that somewhere around 8 sets in a given training session seems to be about the point where some strong diminishing returns occur. we're not really outside that range too much. So one could speculate that this isn't the training volume that really well trained individuals train with, and may not necessitate higher frequencies. One thing to keep in mind for sure there, although I don't know how strongly I view that, but it is at least something to bring up. And then the other thing that it is, I don't think this is an issue, but it is something to mention. They just didn't talk about the rest periods. And so that's another thing to consider that could cause a performance decline. If you're taking 30-second rest periods versus 5-minute rest periods, obviously the set to set decline there is going to look very different. It could be that with, that's another lever to pull, right? Like if I'm an individual and I have a very large set decline set to set, maybe if I rested 2 minutes longer, that's an answer to improve my performance rather than increasing training frequency. I think there's probably diminishing returns on the rest interval end. Like once you're up to like that 3-4 minute rest interval for hypertrophy oriented training, I think you're probably at the cap there, and increasing training frequency is probably more where you want to look, which is why from like a mental model perspective, I'm kind of assuming that you're within the stock standard recommendations of resting somewhere between 2 to 4 minutes per set. And then once that is established, then we can start talking about training frequency. That's kind of the way that I view it. But they did not specifically mention the rest periods here. I would assume, just based on the way that everything else was done, it's probably in the range of 2 to 3 minutes if I had to guess, but we don't know. And so that is a limitation. And obviously, the last thing is just it's only the quads. We only really have this data on the quads. It could be that, there's a ton of anecdotes surrounding biceps and lateral delts and smaller muscle groups that can be trained way more frequently and benefit from being trained way more frequently. So that, to me, still the anecdote supports kind of the overall hypothesis of performance, in the sense that you can maintain performance pretty well with those muscle groups, and they can tolerate a ton of volume. So you just do it more frequently, and you can do both high frequencies and high volumes. But nonetheless, this is only one muscle group that we have direct data on, so that's another limitation to keep in mind. But yeah, other than that, I think the thing I think is the most applicable, at least I tend to think so, from the newsletter, was just the kind of the systematic approach that's kind of proposed at the end of the article. I think that was hopefully pretty practical and kind of distilled things down to a little bit of a framework you can use to kind of decide things on your own training. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you are interested in kind of applying some of this information with the limitations in mind, of course. But yeah, other than that, I think we kind of covered everything, and I'm hopefully people got some out of this.
Perfect. Very last thing I'll just throw out there that I think is another interesting question is what factors that influence performance could matter. So in other words, if we're kind of looking at performance, uh, we're talking about the potential for performance in and of itself influencing how productive a given set is, right? Obviously, actual local muscular fatigue can lead to reductions in performance. But we also know that there are other things that can influence acute performance. Things like preferred versus non-preferred music, things like presence of spotters, things like mental fatigue, things like, at times in some studies, preset carbohydrate mouth rinsing, things like that can essentially have like, I almost want to say like an independent influence on performance. It's like,
Should we chase volume load almost? Like once we're
yeah,
within reasonable constraints of everything else, should we go out of our way to try to get that performance as high as absolutely possible?
right. And that just gets me thinking, like, where does that high performance need to come from? Is it just general, low acute fatigue in the muscles, or can it be extended beyond this? We have an article on our website. It's titled "How Hard Are We Training? Additional Considerations for RER Accuracy," and it kind of talks about. We also had a podcast on it. I think it's episode 21, and we just talk about some of the different factors that can influence how hard you think you're training and thus performance. And I think those might have some implications here. That's a bit of a stretch from what we're talking about and the direct data we have, but I think it's relevant to keep in mind as something to keep an eye on, right? Because all those studies I talked about in that article I just mentioned are acute performance research, right? And we can't necessarily extrapolate it beyond that.
I also think like this is like a really useful paradigm to kind of decide things on the individual level. You know what I mean? Like okay, this matters in general, but does this matter for me? And the question is, okay, does it significantly benefit or harm performance? Like, I just think that's a
Right.
really useful um, lens to view these things through. I think it probably a lot of the times helps to explain, um, yeah, it just helps to explain anecdotes or how people kind of perform differently and just that absolute sheer variability in set to set fatigue, session to session fatigue, exercise to exercise fatigue. Like all those things are so individual. And I think if the only question that remains to be answered conclusively is what is a meaningful difference? That's the thing that's really hard
Yeah.
to define. But again, I think it's a useful framework, and I'm gonna have to think more about what you said because now it has me thinking about all these other things we could do to
And
potentially benefit that for sure.
and if we go back to some of the studies I mentioned in our warm up question, it's like, can we just do more sets and have a higher weekly set volume and this kind of be a non-factor? At what point does that start to, like, if you think about the frequency study you just went over, if they would have done 12 sets in that one session, um, maybe we see considerably more people do better in the leg that had a lower frequency but a higher volume, even if there was diminishing returns, if that makes sense. So those are additional considerations. Um, but yeah, hopefully we gave everyone enough kind of idea fuel. Um, I thought this was really well done. So good stuff, Zach. Anything else you want to drop in here at the end?
Nope, that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, thanks for giving feedback.
Yeah. And make sure you check out the newsletter. We'll link that below. Make sure you're signed up to receive future ones straight to your inbox. And we'll link below the stuff we offer if you're interested in supporting what we do, as well as the studies we mentioned. And with that, we'll see you guys next time.